Hey folks, this is Kelani. An interesting change has popped up on the Battle for Azeroth Alpha relating to the global cooldown and which abilities are being affected by it. So the global cooldown is essentially the break in between using two abilities. This cooldown prevents you from just mashing your abilities over and over again and gives an overall pace to combat. That pace can be increased or decreased to give you a sense of slower or faster combat. Typically ranged classes and casters feel a bit slower compared to melee classes, and a lot of that is to do with the global cooldown. Casters have to hard cast their most powerful abilities and stand still while doing so, while melee characters usually have a lower global cooldown and freedom of movement to give you a faster paced combat style. Back in the day, pretty much every ability was limited by this global cooldown. That's why it's called a global cooldown to begin with. It affects everything, but as time has gone by, more and more abilities were freed from the shackles of the dreaded GCD, but it looks like that might be reversed going into Battle for Azeroth. The dev team seems to have plans to reduce the number of abilities which are not affected by the global cooldown. So let's see what they have in mind and whether or not this could end up slowing down combat as a whole going into the next expansion. Depending on which class you play, this might end up having drastically different implications. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of players ended up playing their preferred class because of how that class feels when you get into combat. It's all fine and dandy thinking you're a mage, but if the standing still and firing off spells with cast times isn't all that fun in practice, you probably won't stick around on a caster too long. But on the other hand, if you absolutely love always having a button to push and the fast-paced combat of a rogue or a monk is more appealing, you'll probably take more of a liking to those classes, even if you still think you're a mage at heart. So what kinds of abilities are usually off the global cooldown? There's sort of only three categories right now: interrupts, cooldowns, and trinkets. A few of these used to be affected by the global cooldown, but after a few expansions we moved to the special side of this discussion. Can you imagine being on interrupts duty for a specific cast with your interrupt being on the global cooldown? Back in the day, players used to literally stop their rotations and wait, just to make sure they didn't lock themselves into those 1 to 2 seconds of not being able to use their interrupt at a key moment. You'll be glad to know that interrupts are remaining as is, not bound by the constraints of the global cooldown. It's those other two categories that the dev team are reapplying some chains to. So powerful cooldowns and on-use effects from trinkets won't be as easy to use if these changes remain in the Battle for Azeroth Alpha, but that might not be an entirely terrible thing. As Ian explains in the forum post about these changes, most cooldowns and trinkets are just lumped into macros these days because it's easier and more efficient. Stacking damage cooldowns is what some classes revolve around. I'm looking at you, Rat Paladins. The start of Legion was good fun, trying to cram as many power boosts as possible into that short window of Crusade, wasn't it? Using cooldowns appropriately became a game of pushing buttons faster or just making a macro or two. At one point for my hunter, my opening sequence consisted of firing off 4 to 5 abilities within a second of the boss being engaged. You just can't do that efficiently without a macro on hand, so that's what cooldowns became. If you get a trinket and it lines up, instead of putting another ability on your bars to use at the right time, you add another line into your burst macro. The forum post also goes into detail about the problems this can cause in PvP. If you can use several cooldowns, trinkets, and offensive abilities in the same heartbeat, there's very little or potentially no counterplay. So this change might seem daunting at first glance, but it could end up being good for the game overall, both in PvE and PvP settings. For PvP, having to spend that global cooldown on activating your damage bonuses gives your enemies a chance to retaliate with cooldowns of their own, or to try and lock you down and back away. Putting defensive cooldowns on the GCD creates situations where you have to decide between going defensive or going offensive, and if you make the wrong decision, you're probably going to get set back a little bit because of it. The same goes for PvE. Having to make choices based upon what's going to happen in the next few seconds will separate the players who really pay attention and those who just end up mashing their keys. Another interesting point brought up in the forum post is that some of these cooldowns have cool animations which are very rarely seen because they're instantly cut off by abilities immediately after the cooldowns are cast or used. So giving that little breath of space could allow the dev team to introduce some really awesome animations unique to each cooldown ability. Some cooldowns are tied very closely to class identity. Imagine if your huge cooldowns came with a sweet new animation. Avenging Wrath or Crusade for Paladins has them reach for the sky like Anduin before their wings burst forth from their back. Icy Veins for Frost Mages has frost travel throughout their body. I'm just spitballing here, but the animations aren't going to be interrupted immediately, so there's some potential there for some really cool stuff. If you put these cooldowns on the GCD and they get some animation attention, you could also set some of these powerful cooldowns up as mini cast times. That would at least make it feel like something is going on instead of everything being instant and you having to wait a little to continue your rotation. But it could be pretty satisfying watching your toon setting up to go crazy. It could be kind of like Stormkeeper for elemental shamans. Even though they're using a cooldown, they raise that artifact up high and channel the storms, ready to unleash a barrage of energy. I think it could work really well if a few things are added in to make it feel like your cooldown is powerful, but most importantly an active part of your rotation. Just pressing the key and having no visual feedback is a little lame, but having to wait for a GCD on top of that might lead a lot of folks to just think about the negatives of this change. Thankfully, the main drawback of these changes seems to have been addressed already. If your cooldown only lasts for 5 seconds and is now hindered by the global cooldown, that would mean you lose a significant chunk of your damage potential. It looks like the dev team plans to increase the duration on any cooldown which would be affected by that problem, such as Recklessness having its duration increased in the latest alpha build. Do take note that it seems like this isn't going to be a broad brush stroke applied to every cooldown in the game. Apparently they're going through with more of a fine comb to see what works on the GCD and what should take a bit of time to cast or set up. Things like Fire Mage Combustion, which you are encouraged to use right after you cast a spell, still works in the same way right now. So this might apply to the majority with a few exceptions. I guess the only way to see what's included and what's not is to wait and see what makes their checklist. I want to give these changes a chance. I don't think it's going to be the end of the World of Warcraft, and honestly I don't expect it to slow things down too much, if at all. Hopefully it's going to make a few choices more important when it comes to your rotations and combat, and we might get some cool animations to boot. As long as interrupts stay off the global cooldown, I think these changes could work out quite well. But what do you think? Will you miss your cooldown macros, or are you excited to see how this all turns out? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.